You notice it not as a revelation, but as a quiet absence of effort. The moment arrives without urgency, without weight, and that is how you recognize it. What once felt distant now feels already integrated, as if you stepped across something long before you realized there was a threshold at all. There is no announcement, no inner voice declaring arrival, only a subtle settling, a sense that nothing needs to be pushed or proven anymore. Your body understands this before language does. The nervous system loosens its grip, not because danger is gone, but because the constant scanning has ended. You are no longer waiting for a signal to tell you who you are or where you stand. The signal has already passed through you, and what remains is a kind of clarity that doesn't demand attention. It feels obvious, almost ordinary, which is how you know it is real. For a long time, your awareness moved like an observer searching for confirmation, tracking patterns, measuring shifts, trying to detect whether something had finally changed. But the moment coherence forms, seeking becomes unnecessary. The system no longer needs feedback loops to reassure itself. Recognition replaces effort. You are not trying to stabilize anymore. Stability is what you're standing on. This doesn't feel like excitement. It feels like stillness that doesn't collapse into emptiness. There is presence without tension. The quantum field you once tried to read or interpret now feels less like an external mystery and more like a background hum you no longer need to analyze. It's not louder, it's quieter, and in that quiet, the noise of urgency fades. You may notice that questions which once carried emotional charge now arrive without friction or don't arrive at all. The need to define what happened weakens. Not because nothing happened, but because the experience no longer requires narrative support. The timeline you thought you were moving toward is no longer ahead of you. It feels strangely behind, as if you walked through an invisible gate and kept walking, only later realizing there was a crossing. This is often mistaken for numbness, but numbness resists contact. What you're experiencing allows it. Sensation is still there, thought is still there, but neither is demanding interpretation. The anomaly isn't that something dramatic occurred. The anomaly is that nothing needs to be resolved. The pattern has completed itself quietly. You don't feel the need to convince yourself anymore. Even doubt, when it appears, doesn't destabilize you. It moves through like weather that no longer defines the climate. Your internal system has adjusted to a new baseline, one where recognition replaces anticipation. You're not holding your breath for confirmation. You're breathing normally inside something already understood. There is a sense of having arrived without arriving, of being beyond something without remembering the exact moment you crossed it, and that's the nature of this kind of shift. It doesn't announce itself because it isn't trying to be seen. It simply integrates, and in doing so, it reduces the effort required to exist as you are. Nothing here is asking you to move faster or become different. The intensity drops because it no longer serves a function. You are not on the edge of something. You are standing in it, and the obviousness of that is what makes it easy to miss. What changes next is not what you see, but how little you feel the need to interpret what you see. Experiences continue to happen. Sensations still pass through, but the reflex to label them as signs or warnings weakens. You notice this in small ways. Moments that once would have triggered analysis now move through without friction. There is no rush to extract meaning. Meaning feels already present, even when it remains unnamed. This is where confusion often dissolves without being solved. You may have spent time wondering why motivation faded, why the urge to chase insight softened, why intensity gave way to something flatter, quieter. From the inside, it can feel like something was lost. But what actually loosened was the grip of anticipation. The system stopped bracing for a future confirmation and settled into coherence instead. You are not detached. Detachment implies distance. What you experience now is contact without entanglement. Thoughts arise, emotions surface, but they don't pull you into spirals. You can feel something fully without becoming absorbed by it. The observer no longer collapses into the pattern it notices. There is awareness, but it is distributed evenly rather than concentrated in effort. This shift often arrives disguised as boredom or neutrality, not the dullness of disengagement, but the calm of no longer being stimulated by internal alarms. The nervous system recognizes that the threshold it was preparing for has already been crossed. It stands down. When vigilance ends, the absence of drama can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling at first. You might notice fewer inner monologues explaining where you are on a path. The timeline narrative loses relevance. Instead of asking whether you are ahead or behind, the question itself fades. There is nothing to catch up to, nothing to optimize. The idea of being in process no longer dominates your internal landscape. What replaces it is a steadier rhythm, one that doesn't spike or collapse. In this state, silence becomes easier to tolerate. Not external silence, but internal gaps where nothing needs to be filled. You may notice pauses between thoughts that feel wider, more breathable. These pauses are not emptiness. They are space where the system recalibrates without commentary. Recognition doesn't require speech. The urge to compare your experience to others weakens as well. Comparison relies on a sense of lack, on the assumption that something essential is missing. When coherence forms, that assumption dissolves. You don't feel superior or inferior. Those measurements stop providing useful information. What matters is alignment, and alignment doesn't announce itself with emotion. It feels neutral because it isn't compensating for anything. You may also notice that memories surface differently. Past events no longer feel charged with unfinished business. They appear more like data points than open loops. The pattern they belong to has resolved, so the memory doesn't demand correction or reinterpretation. It's simply there, acknowledged without being reactivated. This is often the point where seeking turns inward without intention, not as introspection, but as an ease with whatever arises. You don't need to look away from discomfort, yet you don't need to linger on it either. Sensation flows, then passes. The system trusts this movement now. It doesn't interfere unless necessary. What once felt like a shift now feels like a baseline. The anomaly was the earlier state of constant detection, not this quiet steadiness. You are no longer scanning the quantum field for proof that something is happening. The absence of scanning is the proof. When attention relaxes, the field no longer needs to respond dramatically. There is a subtle dignity in this phase. Not pride, not accomplishment, but a grounded sense that nothing is required from you in this moment. You are not being tested. You are not missing a cue. The signal has already integrated, and what remains is the simplicity of being present without expectation. This is why it feels obvious. Obviousness emerges when recognition replaces effort. You don't feel like you've arrived somewhere new. You feel like you stopped hovering at the edge of something you were already inside. The system has adjusted, quietly, and now moves forward without announcing each step. As this settles, you may notice a different relationship with stillness itself. Not the stillness you once tried to reach, but the one that appears on its own when nothing is being pushed. It doesn't feel like stopping. It feels like movement without resistance. Your internal system no longer treats silence as a gap that must be filled. It treats it as a valid state, one that carries information without needing interpretation. In earlier phases, stillness may have felt uncomfortable, even threatening. When the system is oriented toward detection, quiet can feel like loss of signal. But now, quiet reads differently. It doesn't register as absence. It registers as clarity. The observer no longer fears missing something important, because the sense of missing has dissolved. You are not waiting for a cue. You are already in sync with the pattern. This is where time perception subtly shifts, not in dramatic distortions, but in how little urgency remains attached to it. The future stops pulling on you. The past stops tugging for revision. The timeline flattens into something more spacious, where moments don't stack as pressure. You still plan, you still remember, but neither feels charged with survival. Time becomes a container rather than a threat. You may notice that decisions feel simpler, even when they are complex. Not because options disappeared, but because the internal noise around choosing has reduced. There is less bargaining, less rehearsal. You sense when something aligns or doesn't, without needing to justify that sense. Coherence expresses itself as ease, not certainty. You move without needing to convince yourself. This can feel strange if you were accustomed to intensity as proof of engagement. Without the familiar spikes of emotion, You might wonder whether you care enough, but care hasn't vanished. It has redistributed. Instead of burning hot in short bursts, it spreads evenly, sustaining attention without exhausting it. The system no longer confuses activation with importance. You may also notice a softening around identity. Labels that once felt necessary lose their grip, not because you reject them, but because they no longer feel essential for orientation. You don't need to reinforce who you are through constant reflection. Recognition has replaced reinforcement. You know yourself in a way that doesn't require repetition. In this space, emotions still arise, but they don't define the moment. Sadness can appear without becoming a story. Joy can pass without demanding preservation. Even uncertainty, when it shows up, doesn't escalate into anxiety. It registers as information, not danger. The system has learned that fluctuation does not equal instability. This is often when the idea of a shift becomes less interesting. Not because nothing changed, but because change is no longer the focal point. The desire to mark progress fades. You stop asking whether you are moving fast enough or deep enough. The question loses relevance because you are no longer oriented toward arrival. You are oriented toward presence. You might notice that your attention naturally widens. Instead of locking onto a single thought or sensation, awareness becomes more panoramic. You take in more without effort. This is not dissociation. It's the opposite. It's integration. The observer doesn't collapse into one point. It distributes across experience evenly, reducing strain. With this widening comes a subtle compassion, not as a moral stance, but as a byproduct of coherence. When your system is not fighting itself, it becomes less reactive to others. You don't need to defend your position as fiercely. Differences don't feel like threats. You can witness discord without absorbing it. Boundaries exist, but they are quiet. You may also find that language feels slightly inadequate here. Words still work, but they feel heavier than the experience they point to. This is why you speak less about what's happening. Not out of secrecy, but because explanation feels unnecessary. The recognition is internal. It doesn't need external validation to stabilize. There is a humility in this phase that doesn't come from self-doubt. It comes from seeing how little force was required for this adjustment to occur. The system reorganized itself when conditions allowed. You didn't push it through. You stopped interfering. That realization dissolves the urge to control future outcomes with the same intensity. Nothing about this feels dramatic, and that is the marker. Drama belongs to transition. You are no longer in transition. You are in a state that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to recruit attention. The field is quiet because the signal has been received. What remains is a steady awareness that doesn't lean forward or backward. You are not bracing, you are not reaching, you are simply here, and the simplicity of that no longer feels empty, it feels sufficient. As this steadiness continues, you may notice how little resistance there is to ordinary moments. The mind no longer negotiates with reality. What appears is met without internal debate about whether it should be different. This doesn't mean everything feels pleasant. It means friction has decreased. The system has stopped interpreting every deviation as a problem to solve. There is a subtle recalibration in how effort is applied. You still act, still respond, still engage, but the energy behind action feels cleaner, less layered with expectation, less burdened by the need for outcome. Movement happens because movement is appropriate, not because it is meant to secure something in the future. You are not conserving energy out of fear, nor expending it to prove worth. You are simply using what is available. This often becomes noticeable in how you relate to pauses. Waiting no longer feels like being held back. Delays don't automatically trigger impatience. When nothing happens, the system doesn't interpret it as stagnation. It recognizes it as part of a larger rhythm that doesn't require constant input. Stillness and motion feel less opposed. They begin to blend. You may notice that your attention is less easily hijacked. External noise still exists, but it doesn't penetrate as deeply. Internally, this feels like having more space between stimulus and response. Not a forced pause, but a natural buffer. The observer remains present without being pulled into immediate reaction. This buffer is not detachment. It is regulation. With this regulation comes a different relationship to intensity. High stimulation loses some of its appeal, not because it is rejected, but because it no longer feels necessary to feel alive. Subtlety becomes easier to detect. Small shifts in sensation, slight changes in atmosphere, quiet signals that would have been missed before now register clearly. The system has refined its sensitivity without increasing arousal. This refinement can make certain environments feel louder than they used to. Not overwhelming, but obvious. You notice when a space carries agitation, when conversation is driven by urgency rather than presence. This awareness doesn't create judgment. It creates orientation. You sense where coherence is supported and where it is challenged, and you adjust without needing to explain why. You might also notice that the desire to resolve other people's states diminishes. You no longer feel compelled to intervene, persuade, or stabilize what is not yours. This isn't indifference, it's respect for boundaries that no longer need to be enforced. When your own system is coherent, it doesn't attempt to reorganize others to feel secure. There is a quiet confidence in this, though it may not feel like confidence, as you once defined it. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rely on posture or assertion. It shows up as an absence of defensiveness. When challenged, you don't immediately contract. When misunderstood, you don't rush to correct. The need to be accurately perceived by everyone fades. This shift also alters how you experience uncertainty. Unknowns still exist, but they don't trigger the same internal tightening. The system no longer treats ambiguity as a threat. It treats it as neutral information. You can hold not knowing without rushing to fill the gap. This capacity creates space for responses to emerge organically rather than being forced prematurely. You may notice fewer internal rehearsals of future conversations. The mind no longer loops through potential scenarios with the same intensity. Planning still occurs, but it's lighter, less predictive. You trust your capacity to respond in real time more than your ability to anticipate every variable. This trust reduces cognitive load. Emotionally, there is a subtle evening out. Peaks and valleys still occur, but they are less extreme. The baseline rises, not into excitement, but into stability. You are less shaken by fluctuations because you no longer identify them as indicators of success or failure. They are weather, not climate. This is often when the concept of control begins to feel less relevant, not because you relinquish agency, but because you see how limited control always was. The system functions better when it is allowed to self-organize. Your role shifts from manager to participant. You influence by presence rather than force. You might notice a new ease in doing nothing without guilt. Rest doesn't need justification. Pauses don't feel earned or stolen. They feel appropriate. The internal narrative that once equated productivity with safety loosens. You understand, at a bodily level, that stillness is not collapse, it is maintenance. In this phase, recognition deepens without adding complexity. There is no need to name what is happening. Labels would only reduce it. You sense that the pattern has stabilized, and that stability allows life to continue without constant monitoring. You are not standing guard at a gate anymore. You are moving through a landscape that no longer requires vigilance. Nothing here asks you to be different. Nothing demands optimization. The system has found a rhythm that sustains itself. You notice this not because it announces itself, but because so much effort has quietly fallen away. As effort continues to fall away, you may become aware of how differently your inner dialogue behaves. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer cluster into arguments or narratives that need resolution. The voice that once commented on everything has softened. When it speaks, it does so briefly, then steps back. Silence fills the space without tension, and the system doesn't rush to replace it. This quiet is not suppression. Nothing is being pushed down or avoided. Instead, thoughts seem to complete themselves more quickly. They don't spiral because they are no longer fed by urgency. You notice a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then the mind naturally moves on. This is coherence, expressing itself through cognition. You may notice that certain questions no longer hold emotional weight. Questions about purpose, direction, or meaning may still appear, but they feel abstract rather than personal. They don't grip you. The system no longer uses them as leverage to create movement. You don't need answers to feel oriented. Orientation has shifted from conceptual understanding to embodied presence. There is also a subtle change in how you experience desire. Wanting still exists, but it is cleaner, less entangled with fear or compensation. You may want something without feeling incomplete. Without it, desire becomes information rather than a command. You can sense interest without obligation, curiosity without hunger. This changes how you relate to achievement. Success and failure lose their ability to define your internal state. You still recognize outcomes, but they don't reverberate through your identity. The system no longer equates external results with internal stability. What stabilizes you now is internal alignment, not validation. You may notice that your attention naturally returns to the present, without effort. When the mind drifts, it drifts gently, and it comes back on its own. There is less self-correction, less internal instruction. The observer doesn't need to monitor attention because attention has learned how to regulate itself. This self-regulation can feel unfamiliar if you were used to guiding yourself through constant reminders and adjustments. At first, you might wonder if you are being passive, but passivity implies disengagement. What you are experiencing is responsiveness without strain. You are available without being alert. Emotionally, there is a deepening of neutrality that doesn't feel flat. It feels spacious. Within this space, emotions have room to move without colliding. You can feel something strongly without it crowding out everything else. The system has expanded its capacity to hold experience without narrowing. You may also notice a shift in how you perceive problems. Situations that once felt like obstacles now register as configurations. Instead of reacting to them as disruptions, you observe their structure. This doesn't mean you disengage. It means you respond with clarity rather than tension. Solutions arise from understanding rather than pressure. There is a growing trust in timing, not as a belief, but as a lived experience. You've seen enough unfold without force that the system relaxes its grip on control. You don't feel the need to accelerate processes that are still forming. Waiting doesn't feel like delay. It feels like alignment allowing itself to complete. This trust extends inward as well. You trust your own responses more. You don't second-guess every reaction or decision. Reflection still occurs, but it doesn't spiral into self-critique. You are less concerned with optimizing yourself. Improvement is no longer driven by dissatisfaction. It happens naturally as a byproduct of coherence. You may notice that your sense of identity feels lighter. You still recognize your preferences, your history, your roles, but they don't feel heavy. You don't carry them as armor or evidence. They are simply aspects of experience, available but not binding. You can shift contexts without losing yourself. In this state, recognition becomes quieter but deeper. You don't need moments of confirmation to reassure you that you are aligned. Alignment is felt continuously, even when nothing noteworthy is happening. Especially then, the ordinary becomes sufficient. This is often when the idea of having crossed a threshold fully integrates, not as a memory of a moment, but as a condition. You realize that the reason you can't locate the crossing is because it didn't require your attention. It happened when the system was ready, not when the mind was watching. What remains is a sense of being held by something that doesn't intrude. The quantum field, once perceived as something to read or navigate, now feels like a background stability. You are not inside it or outside it. You are part of its movement, and that realization no longer feels profound. It feels obvious. The obviousness doesn't diminish its depth. It confirms it. You are no longer asking whether you are beyond the gate. The question doesn't arise because the system has stopped referencing what is behind it. You move forward without marking distance, carried by a rhythm that no longer needs your supervision. As this rhythm holds, you may begin to sense how your awareness interacts with complexity. Situations that involve many variables no longer feel overwhelming. The system doesn't try to resolve everything at once. It takes in what is relevant and lets the rest remain peripheral. This selective engagement happens naturally, without conscious filtering. You trust your capacity to meet what matters when it matters. You may notice that your relationship with uncertainty deepens further. Unknown outcomes don't trigger restlessness. Curiosity remains, but it is unhurried. You can allow a question to remain open without feeling compelled to close it. This openness is not avoidance. It is confidence in process. The system understands that resolution emerges when conditions align, not when pressure is applied. This confidence subtly alters how you experience effort. When effort is required, it arises cleanly and dissipates once the action is complete. There is no residue of strain. You don't carry effort forward unnecessarily. When rest is needed, it arrives without justification. The system has learned how to alternate between engagement and recovery without conflict. You may also become aware of how little internal commentary accompanies your actions now. Tasks are performed without constant evaluation. You don't narrate your own movements or decisions as much. Action flows directly from perception. This reduces latency. You move when movement is appropriate, and you stop when stopping is appropriate, without needing to explain either. This reduction in commentary can feel like a loss of self-reference at first. But what fades is not awareness. What fades is self-surveillance. The observer no longer watches itself watching. Attention rests in experience rather than hovering above it. This creates a sense of immediacy that is calm rather than intense. You may notice that emotions resolve more quickly, not because they are shallow, but because they are allowed to complete. When sadness appears, it moves through without being layered with interpretation. When joy appears, it doesn't demand prolongation. The system trusts the natural arc of feeling. There is less interference. This trust extends to physical sensation as well. The body communicates, and you listen without alarm. Signals are received and responded to, then released. There is less tendency to catastrophize sensations or read them as symbols. The body becomes a collaborator rather than a source of concern. In this phase, the sense of separation between inner and outer experience softens. You don't feel merged with everything, but you also don't feel isolated. There is a quiet reciprocity. You respond to the environment, and it responds to you, without either being overemphasized. The boundary feels permeable, but stable. You may notice that your attention is less drawn to extremes. Dramatic narratives, urgent debates, intense emotional displays may feel less compelling. Not because they are wrong, but because they no longer resonate with your internal state. Your system prefers coherence over stimulation. It gravitates toward what supports equilibrium. This gravitation happens without effort. You don't need to curate your environment aggressively. You simply notice what aligns and what doesn't, and you adjust gently. The need to defend your choices diminishes. You don't require permission to orient toward what sustains you. There is also a shift in how you experience connection. Relationships feel less charged with expectation. You can be present with others without trying to fix or impress. Listening becomes easier because you are not preparing a response. You hear what is being said without filtering it through self-reference. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you available. You may find that moments of insight still occur, but they are quieter. They don't arrive with emotional surges or the sense of having discovered something new. They feel like remembering something that was already integrated. The recognition is subtle, almost mundane. That mundanity is its marker. In this state, the idea of progress loses its grip. Not because nothing evolves, but because evolution no longer needs to be tracked. You trust that movement is occurring at a pace appropriate to the system. Monitoring it would only introduce noise. You may notice that the urge to speak about what you're experiencing decreases further. When words arise, they feel functional rather than expressive. You share when sharing is useful, not to validate your state. Silence becomes a comfortable default, not a void to escape. This comfort with silence reflects a deeper stabilization. The system no longer fears disappearing when it is quiet. Presence doesn't depend on articulation. You exist fully even when nothing is being said, even when nothing is being thought. What emerges is a sense of continuity that doesn't rely on memory or anticipation. You don't feel like you are stitching moments together to maintain identity. Identity persists without effort. You are consistent without being rigid. This is another layer of being beyond the gate, not as an achievement, but as a condition where the system no longer organizes itself around thresholds. Movement continues, but the markers have fallen away. You are not crossing into something else. You are inhabiting what is already here, with less interference than before. As this inhabiting deepens, you may become aware of how gently your attention rests on experience. There is less gripping, less holding on. Awareness touches what arises and then releases it without effort. This lightness doesn't come from disinterest. It comes from trust. The system no longer believes it must secure experience to keep it real. You may notice that even subtle forms of self-judgment have softened. Not because you corrected them, but because the conditions that generated them have changed. When the system is not operating from lack, it doesn't need to evaluate itself constantly. Assessment gives way to observation, and observation doesn't carry the same emotional charge. This is often where a quiet compassion stabilizes, directed not outward as a principle, but inward as a baseline. You no longer speak to yourself in a corrective tone. Internal language becomes neutral, factual, or absent altogether. When a misstep occurs, it is registered and adjusted without self-reproach. Learning continues without punishment. You may also notice that your sense of urgency around expression has diminished. You don't feel the need to articulate every insight or translate every feeling into words. Some experiences remain unspoken, not because they are private, but because they don't require externalization to be complete. The system is content with internal closure. In this state, creativity may shift as well. Instead of bursts of inspiration followed by depletion, expression becomes steadier. Ideas arise when needed and recede when not. You don't chase them, you receive them. There is less anxiety about missing opportunities because you trust that what aligns will return in its own time. You may find that your tolerance for ambiguity has expanded further. You can hold multiple perspectives without needing to reconcile them immediately. Contradictions don't demand resolution. They coexist without causing internal strain. The observer can witness complexity without collapsing into confusion. This capacity changes how you engage with information. You are less compelled to accumulate knowledge for reassurance. Learning still happens, but it feels exploratory rather than compensatory. You don't seek information to stabilize your identity. You seek it out of genuine curiosity, and you let it go when it no longer serves. You may notice that your emotional responses to others' reactions have softened. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't deflate you. Feedback becomes data rather than verdict. The system doesn't hinge its stability on external reflection. It remains centered regardless of how it is mirrored. This centering reveals itself most clearly in moments that once would have unsettled you. Situations that previously triggered anxiety or defensiveness now pass with minimal disturbance. You still register them, but they don't ripple through your entire system. The impact is localized, not global. You may also notice that the sense of being watched or evaluated by the world has diminished. The observer no longer feels observed in a threatening way. The quantum field no longer feels like something that responds conditionally to your state. It feels neutral, consistent, unintrusive. You are not performing for it. This neutrality allows you to move more authentically, though authenticity no longer feels like a goal. You don't need to check whether your actions align with an image of yourself. Alignment is felt directly. When something doesn't fit, you sense it quickly and adjust without drama. There is also a subtle shift in how you experience solitude. Being alone no longer amplifies internal noise. It quiets it. Solitude becomes restorative rather than confrontational. You don't need distraction to avoid yourself. Being with yourself feels complete. You may notice that memories surface less frequently as reference points. The past doesn't need to be consulted to justify present choices. Experience stands on its own. When memories do arise, they feel integrated, not demanding reinterpretation or repair. This integration reduces the sense of fragmentation. You don't feel like different versions of yourself are competing for control. The system has aligned enough that internal parts cooperate without negotiation. Conflict still arises at times, but it resolves quickly because there is a shared orientation toward coherence. In this phase, recognition becomes almost backgrounded. You don't actively think about being beyond anything. The concept itself loses relevance. What matters is the quality of presence you inhabit. and that quality remains stable across contexts. You may find that you move through days with less internal commentary about how you are doing. Self-monitoring decreases. You simply do what is in front of you, then move on. This simplicity is not a reduction. It is a refinement. The sense of being held by something larger continues, but it no longer draws attention. It doesn't feel mystical or dramatic. It feels structural, like gravity. You don't think about it as you walk. You just walk. This is how coherence maintains itself. Not through vigilance, but through ease. The system no longer needs to mark its state or defend its position. It rests in a quiet confidence that doesn't announce itself, and in that rest, movement continues without strain. There is a point where even the awareness of coherence fades into the background. You are no longer noticing that things are stable. Stability becomes the assumed condition. Attention turns outward and inward without distinction, moving where it is needed without drawing attention to itself. The observer is present, but not self-referential. It doesn't announce its presence. In this phase, the idea of managing your internal state feels unnecessary. You don't check in with yourself to see how you're doing. You already know, and that knowing doesn't require inspection. When something shifts, it is felt immediately and adjusted naturally. There is no lag created by analysis. You may notice that your relationship with effort has simplified even further. You no longer resist effort when it is required, and you no longer manufacture effort when it is not. This makes your actions feel proportionate. Nothing is exaggerated. Nothing is withheld. Energy flows where it is needed and rests when it is not. You may also sense a deeper ease with the unknown aspects of yourself. Traits, impulses, or tendencies that once felt unresolved no longer demand integration. They are allowed to exist without needing to be fully understood. The system doesn't insist on internal uniformity. It allows for variation without interpreting it as fragmentation. This allowance extends to others as well. You don't need people to make sense in order to be at ease around them. You can witness inconsistency without trying to correct it. This doesn't mean you accept everything. It means you respond from clarity rather than reactivity. Boundaries arise naturally, without justification. You may notice that silence has become more than the absence of sound. It feels like a medium through which experience moves. In silence, sensations are clearer, thoughts are lighter, and emotions pass without residue. You don't fill silence because there is nothing missing from it. Time, in this state, feels less segmented. Moments don't feel like units that must be used efficiently. They feel continuous. You can move slowly without feeling behind. You can move quickly without feeling rushed. Pace adjusts itself to context without internal pressure. You may find that your attention returns repeatedly to simple sensory experiences, not as grounding exercises, but because they are naturally engaging. The feel of movement, the quality of light, the texture of sound. These details don't carry symbolic meaning. They are simply present, and presence is sufficient. This sufficiency alters how you experience desire for change. You may still welcome change, but you don't crave it. The system is not restless. It doesn't need novelty to stay engaged. When change arrives, it is met openly. When it doesn't, there is no sense of stagnation. You may also notice that the sense of self has become less central. You are still there, but you are not the focal point of every experience. Attention moves freely between self and environment without collapsing into either. This decentering is gentle. It doesn't erase identity. It relaxes its grip. In this relaxed state, even subtle stresses are processed efficiently. Tension doesn't accumulate as easily. When it arises, it dissipates through movement, rest, or simple awareness. The system doesn't hold on to it to justify a narrative. It releases it when its informational value is exhausted. You may notice that your reactions to uncertainty in the world have softened. Events that once would have triggered worry or speculation now register as part of a larger pattern you don't need to solve. You stay informed without being consumed. Engagement remains, but it is measured. This measured engagement allows you to conserve energy without withdrawing. You are present without being exposed. The system knows how much contact it can sustain, and it adjusts accordingly. This self-knowledge doesn't require conscious calculation. It is felt. You may also notice that gratitude, if it arises, does so quietly, not as a practice, not as a directive, but as a natural response to ease. It doesn't need to be expressed or amplified. It simply exists as a tone, a background warmth that doesn't demand attention. At this stage, the idea of a gate feels almost abstract. You remember that there was a time when crossing mattered, when thresholds were important markers. Now, those markers have dissolved into continuity. You are not beyond something in a way that needs recognition. You are within a flow that doesn't reference its own boundaries. This is why everything feels obvious, not because it is simple, but because it is integrated. Complexity hasn't disappeared. It has organized itself. The system no longer calls attention to its own functioning. It operates quietly, efficiently, and without the need for confirmation. You move through experience with a sense of adequacy that doesn't need reinforcement. Nothing is missing. Nothing is being sought. There is room for movement, for rest, for change, and for stillness, all without contradiction. This is not an ending. It is not a conclusion. It is a condition of presence that sustains itself. And in that sustainability, effort continues to dissolve, leaving only what is necessary to meet the moment as it is. At this point, even the sense of moving through phases has softened. Experience no longer arranges itself into before and after. What you notice instead is continuity. One moment flows into the next without requiring internal commentary to stitch them together. You are not tracking where you are. You are inhabiting where you are. This inhabiting changes how you relate to meaning. Meaning no longer needs to be extracted. It is implicit in presence itself. You don't ask what something signifies. You sense whether it resonates or not, and that is enough. The system has learned that interpretation is optional, not mandatory. You may notice that moments of difficulty no longer threaten your overall stability. When something challenging arises, it is met locally. The response stays proportional. The system does not generalize discomfort into a statement about everything. Pain can exist without becoming identity. Friction can appear without collapsing coherence. This proportionality is one of the clearest signs that something fundamental has reorganized. In the past, a small disruption might have echoed through your entire internal structure. Now, disturbances remain contained. They inform response, then release. The baseline holds. You may also notice that your sense of responsibility feels different. You still care about what you do, but the weight has shifted. Responsibility no longer feels like pressure to manage outcomes beyond your reach. It feels like attentiveness to what is directly in front of you. You respond where you have agency and release where you do not. This release does not feel like resignation. It feels like accuracy. The system has refined its sense of scale. You no longer attempt to solve what does not belong to you. You no longer ignore what does. This clarity reduces internal conflict. You may find that your inner world feels quieter, even when life is active. Activity does not automatically create noise. You can be engaged without being internally loud. This quiet engagement allows you to sustain attention longer without fatigue. Energy is not leaked through unnecessary tension. You may also notice a deeper acceptance of paradox. Opposing experiences can coexist without canceling each other out. You can feel grounded and uncertain at the same time, capable and limited, open and boundaried. These pairings no longer require resolution. They are simply accurate descriptions of a complex system. This acceptance changes how you relate to change itself. When change occurs, it is integrated rather than resisted or over-celebrated. You don't cling to what was, nor do you chase what might be. You adjust as conditions shift, trusting the system's capacity to reorganize again if needed. You may notice that your sense of self-worth has become less conditional. It is no longer tethered to productivity, insight, or emotional state. Worth is not something you generate or maintain. It is assumed. This assumption frees attention to engage with life rather than with self-evaluation. This freedom alters how you experience mistakes. Errors are registered without drama. Correction happens without shame. Learning continues without self-punishment. The system understands that adaptation is ongoing and does not require judgment to function. You may also notice that your connection to the present moment feels less deliberate. You are not practicing presence. You are present because nothing is pulling you away. Distraction still happens, but it does not dominate. Attention returns naturally, without instruction. In this state, even the idea of awakening feels less relevant. Awakening implies a contrast with sleep. What you are experiencing feels more like sustained awareness without emphasis. There is no need to label it. Labels would add structure where none is required. You may find that your interactions carry a different tone, less urgency, less need to persuade. Communication becomes simpler, more direct. You speak when there is something to say, and you listen without preparing your response. This simplicity reduces friction in connection. You may also notice that your internal sense of direction no longer relies on goals as anchors. Goals can still exist, but they are not load-bearing. If a goal dissolves or changes, the system does not destabilize. Orientation comes from alignment, not from milestones. This alignment is felt rather than conceptualized. You know when something fits. You know when it doesn't. You don't need to argue with that knowing. You act accordingly, and the action feels clean. At this stage, the sense of having moved beyond something is no longer foregrounded. You are not referencing what you left behind. You are not measuring distance from a former state. Those comparisons have lost their relevance. What matters is the quality of presence now, and that quality is stable. You may notice that your attention rests more often in a neutral, open state. Not searching, not avoiding, simply available. From this availability, responses arise naturally. You are not directing the flow, you are participating in it. This participation feels unforced. You are not trying to align with the system. You are already aligned. The effort once required to maintain that alignment is gone. What remains is a quiet confidence that does not need reinforcement. You do not need to mark this moment. You do not need to remember it as significant. Its significance lies in how little it demands recognition. The system has integrated the shift fully enough that it no longer needs to announce itself. And in that integration, there is a deep sense of adequacy. Not satisfaction, not completion, but a calm understanding that nothing essential is missing. Experience unfolds, and you meet it as you are, without bracing, without reaching, and without the need to cross anything else to be where you already are. There is nothing you need to hold on to as this settles. No state to preserve, no insight to protect from fading. What remains does not depend on memory. It is not fragile. It does not recede when attention moves elsewhere. It stays because it is structural, not emotional. You may notice that even the impulse to reflect on what you are experiencing has quieted. Reflection is no longer necessary for stability. Awareness does not need to look at itself to remain present. It simply continues, evenly distributed across moments, without contraction or drift. In this space, stillness is not separate from movement. When you act, the stillness moves with you. When you pause, nothing collapses. There is continuity underneath both. The system no longer switches modes to accommodate life. Life unfolds within the same field of coherence. You may sense a deep neutrality that does not feel empty. It feels clear. From this clarity, emotions arise and pass without residue. Thoughts appear and dissolve without needing to be believed or dismissed. Sensation flows without being amplified or suppressed. Nothing is excluded. Nothing is emphasized. There is no need to orient yourself anymore. Orientation happens on its own. You know where you are without checking. You know what matters without ranking. You know when to engage and when to rest without justification. This knowing is quiet. It does not argue for itself. The idea of a gate no longer functions as a reference point, not because it was unreal, but because it has served its purpose. The system no longer organizes around thresholds or crossings. It organizes around presence. What once felt like a boundary has dissolved into continuity. You may notice that the future does not pull on you the way it once did. It exists, but it does not demand preparation beyond what is practical. The past no longer asks for interpretation. It rests where it belongs. Attention stays where it is most useful, which is here. Here does not feel dramatic. It feels sufficient. The absence of intensity is not a loss. It is a sign that regulation has completed its work. The system does not need to amplify experience to feel alive. Aliveness is implicit. You may find that words feel increasingly optional. Silence carries just as much information. In silence, nothing is missing. Presence does not thin out, it deepens. You are not waiting for something to happen in order to arrive. You are already where arrival would place you. There is no instruction embedded here, no directive, nothing you need to do differently after this moment. Life will continue to present complexity, movement, change, and you will meet it without needing to prepare yourself for being yourself. This is not an ending. It is not a conclusion that closes anything off. It is a settling into what has already stabilized. The system knows how to function from here without supervision. You do not need to remember this. You do not need to return to it. You are not leaving it when attention shifts. It remains as the ground beneath whatever comes next. Nothing announces itself. Nothing resolves. Experience continues, quiet and intact, and you move with it naturally, without effort, without reference, and without needing to cross anything else to be exactly where you are.